slapped a turtle? Was that it? Yeah, okay. I don't know how to Nihongify that, but the man who slapped a turtle is the story that we're going to tell you in English. Right? Okay, we're good? Take it away, guys.
On John's first scientific expedition, he went to the beach.
On John's first scientific expedition, he went to the beach, but he had stayed out too late partying the night before and had a hangover and was in a terrible mood.
On John's first scientific exhibition, he went to the beach, but he had been up partying all night and had a hangover and was in a terrible mood. He stared out at the endless waves, wave after wave after wave, and saw on the horizon
On John's first scientific expedition, he went to the beach. But he had been partying all night the night before, and he had a terrible hangover, and he was in a really, really bad mood. He stared out at the sea, wave after wave coming in, when suddenly, on the horizon, there it was. He saw the famous dark shape he was looking for. He had found the sea monster.
On John's first scientific expedition, he went to the beach. But he had drank a little bit too much the night before, and he was kind of hungover, and he was in a really bad mood. So he looked out on the ocean. Wave after wave after wave came in on him, and he saw way off in the distance the dark figure, which is what he was looking for, which was a giant sea monster. John had been studying the sea monster for years, and he knew the only song that would draw it closer, and he sang it in perfect pitch and harmony.
On his first scientific expedition, John went to the beach. But he had been out partying too late the night before, and he had a really bad hangover, and he was in a terrible, terrible mood. And so he stood out there looking at the ocean and watched wave after wave after wave after wave coming in, and then he saw it on the horizon, that famous dark shape, the sea monster. And John had spent so long studying the sea monster and looking for it, and he knew the one song that would capture it. And so he sang in perfect harmony and melody and pitch. Kawa no
exhibition, John went to the beach, but he had been partying the night before and had a terrible hangover and was in an awful mood, and so he looked out at the waves, the endless waves, wave after wave after wave, and he saw on the horizon the dark shape of the sea monster. And John had spent years studying the sea monster, and he knew the only song that would draw it closer, and he sang it in perfect pitch and harmony, exactly as it was just sung. And the sea monster looked at John, and John looked back at the monster. He met that monster's gaze, looked at its scaly face and into its very soul. And John knew. John knew, after looking into the eyes of the monster, that there was only one way to defeat it.
On John's first scientific expedition, he went to the beach. However, he had been partying the entire night long and had a terrible hangover and was in a really, really bad mood. As he stared out onto the horizon, wave after wave came in over him, and as he kept staring, he saw the famous dark shape that he had been looking for years and years. It was the sea monster. Now, John had been
the only song that would bring it in, and so he sang it in perfect pitch and in harmony. And it was Enka. And as the monster drew closer and closer, he stared into the scaly face. He looked straight into the monster's eyes. And John knew. John knew. As he stared straight into the monster, he knew the one way to defeat it. And the only way to defeat it was to perform the most perfect salsa dance that has ever been done.
On John's first scientific expedition, he went to the beach. But he'd been out the night before partying a little bit too hard, and he was hungover, and he was in a bad mood. And he stared out at the horizon, wave after wave after wave coming in. He saw the telltale sign of the sea monster on the horizon. John had been studying the sea monster intensely, and he knew the only song that would draw it closer. So he sang that song in perfect pitch and harmony. And he sang, to me. And the sea monster came closer as John looked at it in its eyes. And the sea monster looked at its eyes, and he looked at their eyes for a little while. They connected, they had a conversation, they liked each other. And John knew the only way to defeat this monster was to dance a really nice salsa. Luckily, John had been to Mexico and other Spanish-speaking countries like that where they dance, and he just started shaking And the monster laid there after being dipped and said, John, you have my heart. If only you could name the previous 6 Japanese prime ministers.
On his first scientific expedition, John went to the beach. But he'd been out partying a little too hard the night before, and he had a really bad hangover, and he was in a terrible mood, and so he stood out there and he looked at the waves, and wave after wave after wave came in, and then there on the horizon he saw it, the telltale dark shape of the sea monster. And now John had been studying and looking for the sea monster for years and years, and so he knew the one song that would bring it in closer, and so he sang in perfect pitch and harmony. And the monster stared at him, and he stared back at the monster, and the monster stared at him, and he stared into the monster's soul, and the monster stared at him, and he stared into the monster's scaly face. And he knew the only way to defeat this monster was to do the most perfect salsa dance there ever was. But fortunately, John had been to Mexico and other Spanish-speaking countries where they do these sort of dances, and so he was all ready and he did some salsa. And the monster fell to the ground. I said, John, you've captured my heart. If only you can name the previous 5 Japanese And John said, don't they come like every 30 seconds? How am I supposed to know? But then, he realized that he so terribly wanted the sea monster's heart after all of these years of work and study and more work and more study and a little bit of partying in between. And so, he took a deep breath and he looked down at the monster lying on the sand and said, you're not really a monster at all, and so, for your heart, I will.
On his first scientific expedition, John went to the beach, but he had been out partying the night before and had a terrible hangover and was in a terrible mood. And he looked out at the endless waves, wave after wave after wave, and saw on the horizon the dark, telltale shape of the sea monster. And he looked at the sea monster and he knew that we've been studying the sea monster for years and years, and knew that the only way to attract it would be to sing a song in perfect pitch and harmony. And so he sang Opera Gangnam Style, and then the sea monster was attracted by this wonderful song, and he looked into the sea monster's eyes, and the sea monster looked back at him, and he looked into the sea monster looked back at him, and several hours later, they were looking into each other's eyes, and he knew the only way in which he could defeat the monster, and that was to dance the most perfect and wonderful salsa dance that had ever been danced. And luckily, he had been to Mexico, and he knew how to dance like they do. And so when he danced like they do in Mexico, in Argentina, he did a crazy salsa dance. And the sea monster looked at him after it had been dipped with some difficulty, because it had a slippery shell. There is one way to my heart. If you can name the 6 previous Japanese prime ministers, I will have you. And John said, don't they come like every 30 seconds? So they continued their conversation. The sea monster, who was not in fact a monster, but just a common or garden sea turtle, said, I'm a little bit disappointed that you didn't name any Japanese prime minister. Surely you must know at least one. John said, in all my scientific expeditions, I've remained a bit disconnected from life in Japan, but I do know one Japanese prime minister. Not the last one, but the one before that. And I will tell you his name.
On John's first scientific expedition, he went to the beach. But he had been partying the whole night, and he had a terrible hangover and was in a really, really bad mood. And as he stared out onto the horizon with wave after wave coming in off the ocean, he saw it. There on the horizon, there was the mysterious, famous dark shape that he had been looking for all of his life, the sea monster. And as John had studied this sea monster for many, many years, he knew the only song that could bring in this sea monster, and so he sang it in perfect pitch and in perfect harmony. I want you, I need you, I love you. Something like that. Anyway, as the sea monster drew closer, he looked into the sea monster's soul, and the sea monster looked back at him. And he looked into the monster's soul, and he looked back at him, and they kept going on like this for hours and hours and hours. Until John finally stepped out of his trance and remembered the only way to defeat this monster was to dance the most perfect salsa that had ever been danced before. Now John was fortunate, as he had gone to Mexico and other Spanish-speaking countries where they do this sort of thing. And so he just salsa'd his way over and looked kind of more like a Roomba, but it's okay. And the sea monster fell in love. As he dipped him, the sea monster looked into his eyes and said, oh, John, you will have my heart if you could name the last 6 prime ministers of Japan. And John said, they come every 30 seconds. How do you expect me to know any of them? And the sea monster looked back at him as John thought about the only other way he could win the monster's love. But as he thought about it, the sea monster looked at him and said, you know, John, I'm very disappointed. You did not name me even one Japanese prime minister. I expected a little better from you. And John said, well, I have been spending my entire life studying and researching you. Why would I keep up with the affairs of Japan? But I do know one prime minister. Not the previous prime minister. The prime minister